The empire has fallen, but how? If you don't understand, let Helvetia tell you. Stay with us, and you'll never see history the same way again.
At its peak, Rome seemed unstoppable. 1 million people crowded into the capital, and armies guarding its frontiers from Britain to Syria. But what if Rome's greatest enemy wasn't a rival empire or invading horde? What if it was something far smaller, something invisible? Plagues, climate shocks, and disease didn't storm the gates. They slipped inside, weakening the empire from within. This is the story of how unseen forces, alongside politics and war, played a fatal role in Rome's collapse. And to understand that, we first need to look at why Rome once appeared invincible. To observers in antiquity, Rome gave the impression of a civilization without limits. The capital, perhaps 1 million people at its height, stood at the center of a system that seemed designed for permanence. By the time of the Pax Romana, roughly the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the empire's machinery appeared unshakable. Grain fleets carried food from Africa and Egypt to ports that sustained the huge urban population. Aqueducts bridged valleys and tunneled through stone, channeling water into fountains, baths, and private homes. Stone roads extended for thousands of miles, tying together territories from Britain to Syria, Gaul to Egypt. From the outside, Rome looked like a flawless engine of power. Yet the picture shifts when scholars examine the evidence more closely. Skeletal remains from this very period suggest that many urban residents were in poorer health than their ancestors. Archaeologists note lower average stature, and bones show markers consistent with malnutrition and infectious disease. Historian Kyle Harper has described the Romans as rich but sick, living in dense, bustling centers that displayed grandeur but carried hidden fragility. Even as marble temples rose and banquets dazzled the elite, ordinary bodies reflected regular exposure to stress and illness. This contrast between surface splendor and underlying weakness becomes easier to grasp when set against modern parallels. Vast metropolises today present neon skylines and soaring highways to the eye. But public health experts point out how dense populations magnify small disruptions, whether air pollution, epidemics, or food supply strains. Rome's growth worked in a similar way. Overcrowding turned minor shortages into recurring crises. Narrow streets lined with tenement housing left families vulnerable to contaminated water and spoiled grain. Success had created its own trap. The very networks that enabled prosperity also amplified disease and deprivation. Those same networks reached across the empire's trade and military system. Goods flowed in endless streams: wine, olive oil, glassware, grain. Along with them, unseen passengers moved too. Pathogens traveled on merchant ships, in army baggage trains, and through caravan routes connecting one end of the Mediterranean to the other. What looked like interconnected strength was, in biological terms, a perfect distribution system for microbes. An outbreak in a provincial garrison could, in a matter of weeks, reach distant cities once thought secure. The most striking example of this hidden danger came during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, around 185 to 180 CE. The empire was struck by what became known as the Antonine Plague. Contemporary sources describe its rapid spread through military camps and urban centers alike. Modern estimates vary, but many scholars agree that mortality was substantial, possibly reaching into the hundreds of thousands or more across the empire. For an imperial system tied so closely to manpower, the losses were devastating. Recruitment faltered, border defenses thinned, and the foundations of Roman security began to shift. The plague did not pass cleanly. Outbreaks recurred in cycles, repeatedly stripping the healthy to a reduced base. At each return, citizens looked toward the imperial state for reassurance, yet emperors themselves could not command nature. Soldiers armed with iron could not stop a fever carried invisibly through villages and barracks. Water, roads, and fleets, symbols of Roman order, were powerless when the challenge came as an unseen contagion. Every wave left the state weaker, not through visible conquest, but through attrition at the level of ordinary households. The grandeur of Rome's monuments, the steady march of its legions, and the reach of its trade routes all reinforced a sense of permanence. But beneath this exterior lay a different truth. Malnutrition, overpopulation, and recurring disease had already exposed a fragile core. The supposed eternity of the empire rested on bodies that were vulnerable to forces beyond political control. And as the Antonine outbreak demonstrated, Rome's most insidious threats did not march with armies. They moved silently, through lungs and bloodstreams, eroding strength from within. That first great epidemic was only a beginning. The next great enemy would leave soldiers dead without a battle, and reveal how fragile even the greatest of empires could be. For Rome, the gravest dangers often came not from soldiers at the frontier, but from illnesses carried silently across its provinces. The first great epidemic we can trace arrived during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Known as the Antonine Plague, it struck between circa 165 to 180 CE, spreading through military camps and cities with devastating speed. Contemporary writers described it as unlike anything they had ever seen, a crisis that overwhelmed entire regions. Some modern scholars suggest the illness may have been smallpox or a related viral disease, but its true identity remains uncertain. What is clear is its scale. Estimates run into the millions of lives lost. Legions that had trained for years collapsed without ever drawing a sword, undone by an enemy that passed invisibly from breath to breath. The losses extended far beyond the battlefield. Rome's borders stretched for thousands of miles, yet when whole cohorts sickened, the frontier suddenly looked fragile. Villages and frontier garrisons that had stood firm for generations now faced the enemy, with depleted ranks. Even Rome's great forts seemed vulnerable when their watchmen had vanished. For once, external enemies did not need to risk an assault. Disease had already done the work of weakening Rome's defenses. The empire had little time to recover. Less than a century later, a second catastrophe arrived. Around circa 249 to 262 CE, a widespread epidemic swept through the empire, later called the Plague of Cyprian, after the bishop who described its horrors. Like the Antonine outbreak, scholars continue to debate its cause, with suggestions ranging from viral hemorrhagic fevers to other unidentified pathogens. What matters more than the medical details is its destructive rhythm. Outbreaks recurred in waves, each one leaving fewer healthy adults to till farms, staff fleets, or serve in the legions. Whole communities shrank as people either died or fled. Fields went untended. Grain shipments became irregular. Cities that once bustled with labor found workshops and warehouses half empty. The social atmosphere grew equally dire. Multiple witnesses wrote about mass death and panic, describing towns echoing with fear and families abandoning sick relatives. Travelers avoided entire provinces, turning isolation into an additional hardship. In cities, fear could kill as effectively as illness. Homes were deserted, trade routes fell silent, and confidence in the empire eroded. At the very moment citizens sought protection, imperial decrees proved powerless. Emperors could raise taxes, issue laws, or march armies, but none of these could seal the invisible contagion spreading through streets and villages. The economic consequences compounded the crisis. Rome relied on steady taxation of farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. But when fields lay empty and towns lost their workers, tax receipts collapsed. Without revenue, soldiers could not be recruited or paid. Forts lost their upkeep, and the quality of equipment declined. Survivors faced harsher demands from governors desperate to fill the treasury, which only deepened resentment. Historians link these epidemics directly to reduced recruitment, declining tax income, and shrinking labor across agriculture and trade. A state once sustained by abundance was undermined from the inside by scarcity and distrust. In spite of all this, Rome did not collapse immediately. The empire endured for centuries after both the Antonine and Cyprian plagues. Yet each successive outbreak left the population smaller, the armies thinner, and the bond between emperor and people weaker. By the 4th century, Rome still governed vast lands, but the strength that had once seemed limitless was fraying. Disease had become a recurring test of durability, draining not just lives, but the very systems on which imperial order depended. As these invisible plagues reshaped the empire, another threat was preparing to strike. Unlike contagion, it would not come through lungs or bloodstreams. Instead, it would arrive from the skies themselves, dimming the light that Rome relied on for survival. In 536 CE, observers across the Mediterranean and beyond recorded a strange twilight. For roughly 18 months, the sun lost its full brightness, casting only a dim, pale light even at midday. Writers noted that winters grew harsher, while summers seemed to vanish. Crops withered, harvests failed, and food supplies dwindled. Centuries later, scientists uncovered the cause. Ice core chemistry from Greenland and Antarctica, combined with tree ring evidence, pointed to colossal volcanic eruptions that injected sulfur into the stratosphere. The fine particles hung there like a global veil, scattering sunlight and cooling the climate across continents. Historians and paleoclimatologists now call the result the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a prolonged, decades-long period of cooling triggered by mid-6th century eruptions. For societies already weakened by centuries of recurring plague and political turmoil, the new climate shock proved overwhelming. Regions dependent on wheat and barley harvests found fields producing only stunted yields. Vineyards barely ripened fruit. Olive groves faltered. Farmers, unsure of when to plant, gambled resources on crops that either failed outright or came in too late to sustain demand. The disruption was not isolated to a single province. Records and natural evidence together show widespread effects across Europe, North Africa, and large parts of Asia. Instead of resilience through regional diversity, food insecurity became systemic. A critical piece of evidence comes from the trees themselves. Tree rings in northern Europe and Central Asia show some of the narrowest growth in over 2 millennia during the 530s and 540s. Each constricted ring marks a year with colder temperatures and limited sunlight, piling one weak season on top of another. Agriculture depends on predictability. Without reliable springs and summers, subsistence collapsed into repeated cycles of hunger. In cities, these pressures focused into crisis. Constantinople, the thriving capital of the Eastern Empire, relied on huge volumes of imported grain, especially from Egypt. When North African harvests faltered, Constantinople's bread supply faltered with them. Bread that once fed 500,000 residents became scarce, prices surged, and unrest followed. Hunger not only destabilized the city, but also weakened resistance to disease. Malnourished bodies carried lower immunity, and scarcity forced many into crowded spaces where infections spread quickly. The link between famine and illness became tragically clear within a few years. In 541 CE, the Justinianic plague arrived. Ancient DNA research today identifies the culprit as Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium behind later waves of bubonic plague. Striking a population already fatigued by years of hunger, the epidemic swept through the empire with devastating mortality. Death piled upon famine, creating a feedback loop where fewer laborers tended fields, further reducing food and further thinning the population. The rural world outside the big cities faced similar collapse. After repeated crop failures, many fields were abandoned. Herds diminished as fodder ran short. Families who once sold their surplus for coin now struggled to produce enough to endure the winter. With little to sell, tax revenues withered. Without taxation, imperial administrators starved of funds. Soldiers could not be paid. Fleets lacked supplies. Builders stood idle, and state infrastructure unraveled. What had once been Rome's strength, its vast, centralized supply system, now became a weakness. Shortages leapt from one province to the next, and the whole chain strained under the prolonged shock. This sequence underscores a harsh reality. Unlike invasions or rebellions, which could be fought with armies or policy, no emperor had the power to lift volcanic ash from the skies, or to compel a frozen summer to yield crops. The mid-6th century tested the limits of imperial resilience, forcing leaders to confront forces far beyond human command. The late antique Little Ice Age revealed just how dependent the empire was on steady harvests and predictable cycles of nature. By the time volcanoes dimmed the sun and plague gutted the population, the structures that had carried Rome through centuries were under unbearable strain. Food supplies, military budgets, and systems of taxation, the pillars of Roman state power, all faltered in turn. And when those pillars shook, the political order began to tremble with them. When Rome's environment and health crises strained its resilience, the impact fell most heavily on the systems that held the empire together: its food supply, armies, and finances. The grain lifeline was the first to show visible weakness. Rome's vast urban population depended on regular shipments from North Africa and Egypt, with daily wheat imports feeding hundreds of thousands in the capital. These were not luxuries, but necessities. Without them, the city could not survive. When climate instability or invasion interrupted that flow, repercussions were immediate. For example, when the Vandals seized Carthage in 439 CE, one of the West's main grain arteries was severed. The result was hunger in a capital that had grown well beyond what the Italian countryside could support. Rationing and rising unrest followed, eroding confidence in the state's ability to provide. At the same time, the army, once the backbone of imperial order, was under mounting strain. epidemics, and demographic decline left fewer men available for service. To fill the ranks, emperors increasingly relied on migrant groups settled within the empire. These federated groups, known as foederati, supplied troops in exchange for land and stipends. While the arrangement offered quick relief at the frontiers, it carried its own risks. The soldiers' loyalty remained tied to their communities as much as to Rome, and commanders from outside Italy sometimes acted with independent agendas. A new question arose. Were the borders defended for the empire, or for groups now granted power within it? Meanwhile, the empire's finances buckled under overlapping pressures. Each epidemic reduced the tax base. Fewer farmers and traders meant less surplus to tax, and local officials increased burdens on the survivors. Villages often could not meet quotas. Land fell vacant, families fled, and the heavy demands only deepened exhaustion. Corruption flourished in these conditions. Tax collectors took bribes, shielding some estates while squeezing others even harder. Monetary instability compounded the crisis. In the 3rd century CE, debasement of silver coins had caused runaway inflation, and though later reforms under Diocletian and Constantine attempted to stabilize the system, confidence in coinage never fully recovered. A bloated military absorbed much of the treasury, yet payment often fell behind. Soldiers, once disciplined and loyal, increasingly looked to whichever general promised them food, land, or gold. The divisions between East and West exacerbated the strain. Without unified leadership, each half of the empire pursued separate priorities. Local rulers put survival of their regions before the wider imperial system. Fragmented authority meant that multiple crises, grain shortages, fiscal collapse, manpower loss, and disease, reinforced one another. A weakened tax structure hampered military pay. A weakened military exposed grain routes to attack. Blocked grain routes lowered morale and trust in government. The system did not fall all at once, but the interlocking stresses made recovery more difficult every year. Rome's decline was therefore not the sudden fall of a fortress wall, but the steady weakening of structures that seemed eternal. Food, armies, and revenue, the essential pillars of imperial power, continued to erode until the system no longer sustained itself. Rome's decline cannot be explained solely by corrupt emperors or invading armies. Disease drained its population. Climate shocks undermined its food supply. And together, these pressures revealed the limits of even the ancient world's most advanced empire. Yet not everything vanished. Rome's political institutions collapsed in the West, but its law, cities, and the church endured, while the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, state preserved much of Roman legacy for centuries. The lesson is still relevant. As recent scholarship argues, climate shifts and pandemics can transform even resilient states. A reminder that social resilience, not just military strength, determines survival. If this new view of Rome surprised you, subscribe and hit like, and tell us in the comments, which unseen enemy surprised you most?